I think we can make a start, yeah? So, very informal, but I just felt that I needed to introduce my good friend, colleague, and very soon co-author of about 15 papers that we've planned for the future, WACC Lonsmann, which is clearly not how she would pronounce it, but hopefully she can recognize her name into it, from the Copenhagen Business School. WACC is doing, and we have common interests in the area of workplace discourse, and has been doing research on language choice, language use, and language ideology, particularly in workplace settings, and workplace settings that would self-identify as being international. So we have a number of different areas of common interest, and we've been interacting for couple of years at least, I would say, as part of different projects and sub-projects, so different panels that WACC and colleagues from Denmark have organized, and I was very honored to be part of, special issues, all sorts of different activities. So there has been a lot of discussions, and it's also part of a very good group of researchers at different stages of their career, so they also bring different perspectives in Denmark, from different universities in Denmark, also working in this sort of area, but also in different settings, which includes also academic settings, and there has been a lot of work into that. So I think there is this kind of like as a background, but WACC today is going to talk about something that we're very interested in, and I think matches the interest of many of us in this room, which is about the role of the researcher, and particularly the role of the researcher when we talk about ethnographic research, and when we talk about qualitative research, where there is a lot of talk about subjectivities and so on, but what exactly do we mean by all that? And I think WACC has spent some time doing some very good reflexive work on that, and she's going to share the results of that today with us. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you.
And for 3 very enjoyable days.
Definitely.
Kind of like last thing before you.
I know. Yes, I'll be going straight to the airport from here. I thought I would first explain some of the logos I put on here so that you can help explain who I am and what I'm doing. I'm at the Copenhagen Business School, which is the blue logo up there. But I collaborate with researchers from Roskilde University, which is the other logo. What we're doing, we call the LingCorp project, and it's an ethnographically based investigation of challenges and barriers in multilingual workplaces. And we're funded by the Danish Council for Independent Research, so I have to acknowledge that wherever I go. And today I've chosen to talk about research methodology, particularly this thing I'm working on about negotiating positionality. And it is I'm hoping to turn this into an article very soon, so I'll really appreciate any kind of feedback that you have on what I'm presenting here and where it could go. But I want to begin with this. Why do we need to talk about positionality as ethnographic researchers? Well, because we're always positioned. Whether we acknowledge it and talk about it, we always are. And this position, or these positions that we take or are put in, they have an impact on what we can see as researchers, what we have access to as researchers. So, in other words, where you stand influences your perspective. A second reason for talking about this is related to some of what Malcolm was saying in the talk that I just went to. He said, I'll talk about all the blemishes of this work that I'm doing. And that's kind of what I want to do here as well. I want to talk about the messy business of data collection, because often when you read studies of ethnographic studies of data collection, it sounds so easy. I got access to this company, I went in, I conducted 5 interviews, and here's the analysis. And especially if you're a young researcher, you're like, oh wow, how do they do that? It just sounds so easy. But it's not often that easy, especially the whole gaining access part. And I think that if we share our reflections and talk about our experiences, well, it'll be easier for all of us to deal with future challenges. So, this leads me to the 2 points that I'm going to discuss today. How is researcher positionality negotiated in the interaction? And I have some examples that I want to show you of different positions and different negotiations, and that should lead me to a discussion of how these negotiations of positionality impact on the access to data that you have as a researcher. And I mean both access to individual companies, but also to individual informants and to the kind of stories they tell, the kind of data they lead you to. And this is the outline of the talk. but I'll move on to talking about positionality, particularly in the world of international business. Now, in traditional ethnography, where the ethnographer went into the jungle and studied a tribe and their way of life, the researcher was often in the position of researching down, as it was called. He was more powerful, had higher status than the people he was investigating, and that has often been conceptualized as researching down. When you're doing interviews or other kinds of field work with people in international business, sometimes, but not always, you find yourself researching up. You're talking to more powerful people. This can have different kinds of effects. One effect can be that when you're doing interviews with these big shots, you find yourself in kind of a supplicant's position. So you're maybe afraid to ask critical questions. Or you can also, with these elite informants, find yourself in a position where they become too dominant and they try to take over the interaction. We have a very good example of that in one of the LinkCorp interviews that my colleagues did. They're interviewing a manager for a very large Danish company. He has been asked to set aside 30 minutes for this interview about diversity in the international workplace. And about halfway through these 30 minutes, he completely hijacks everything and puts on his own PowerPoint presentation and starts showing that to the interviewers, who just kind of just play along with it. And afterwards they were like, he completely hijacked everything, and it ends up being an hour and a half, and he presents everything about this company, and this was not what they had in mind. But it's a great example of how the status and power negotiations that take place through these kinds of interactions. So, and I have this quote that's from this article where they talk about researching elites and how that's different from researching other kinds of settings, because what they're saying is that in these settings, the power negotiations are always there. There is always a factor. Prestige is always at stake, whereas in some other settings, it might not be so much. However, I want to say that when I talk about positionality, it's not only about power and status. That's one dimension. There are several other dimensions that are at least as important: age and gender and culture, but also more fluid and changing identities. So it could be temporary roles as someone who gives advice, or someone you can talk to about your problems. And these identities, as I will show later, are also important. Now, about gaining access. I don't know how many of you do and have done ethnographic fieldwork. You have tried, some of you, to gain access, and maybe also to companies. It can be very difficult, it can be very frustrating, and sometimes that part takes longer than any other part of the research process. When you want to access elite informants, there are a few things that are perhaps different from when you want access to other kinds of sites. Sometimes you're advised as an ethnographer to reassure your informants and to be careful not to use technical language, and like reassure them that you're not this dangerous person coming in. But when you want to talk to the top manager of Carlsberg, there are a couple of other things you have to do, and one of those things is proving your professional credentials. So by referring, for instance, frequently to the very, very renowned business school that you're from, or the very prestigious university. You can also draw on your own elite status as a member of academia. That's of course easy if you are actually a professor, not a PhD student. But you do actually also have some status. And if you have done research in other companies who they may know, you can refer to that. It's always good to be able to, casually say, oh, when I talked to, Sørensen over at Carlsberg, he always used to tell these stories, blah, blah, blah. Look at me. I'm one of you guys. But all of these points relate to who the researcher is and how the researcher positions him or herself, because that is very important in gaining access. The theory that I'm drawing on for this project is Buchholz and Hall's sociocultural linguistic perspective of identity, where they define identity as the social positioning of self and other. But what I'm particularly interested in are the three levels of identity that they operate with, because in pretty much everything I've read about positionality of the researcher and ethnographic research, the analyses deal with these macro-sociological categories. So they're about ethnicity, or about age, or about gender. How do you research a male workplace if you're female, or how do you talk to white people if you're black? But I want to focus on the other levels here, some of the more transient identities, things that change, or things that are more locally negotiated. And that goes with my view of identity as something that is dynamic and relational, something that is negotiated in the interaction, and something where you may position yourself, but you're also at the same time being positioned by others, and you may accept these positionings, or you may reject them, or at least try to negotiate them. So this leads me to the data. It comes from 2 research projects. The first one was one I did. It ran from 2006 to 2011. That was my PhD project, actually. That was a case study of one company. It focused on language choice and language ideologies in this company, and I have a range of data from that project. And the other project is the one I was mentioning before, the collaboration with the researchers from Roskilde. This is the whole full title of it. But briefly put, it's a multidisciplinary study of, and I think we have 15 companies involved now. Or workplaces, I should say. But the data for this project consists of 59 ethnographic interviews, participant observation, and field notes, and also some emails between me and some of the informants. And what I'm doing is a reflexive analysis. So the data was collected for other purposes. The data was collected to look at language choice or language ideologies, but here I'm focusing on the actual process of collecting the data. And let's look at some of that. So now I want to look at some of the research or some of the positions I've been put in or have put myself in as a researcher, and talk about how that has impacted my access to data. And the first one is the dichotomy between being a researcher and or being a consultant. Now, when you're trying to gain access to business settings, you're often trying to make it very clear to the participants what they can get out of it, or at least that can be a good idea to do if you want them to spend their time participating. But at the same time, you have your own goals, which may not match exactly what they want. And as an ethnographer, it's kind of built in that I want to give something back to the community. I want this reciprocity, but on the other hand, I don't want to spend all my time doing seminars for them, because I also have to publish articles. So there can be a conflict between these 2 sets of goals. And what I think you need to do is to find out where these overlap and see if you can focus on that area. But it's also important in this process to be aware of how you position yourself. And now when I look back at what we were doing when we started the LingCorp project, I've noticed that we were kind of doing 2 things. So this is part of the information sheet that we sent out or gave to participants initially. And we're definitely positioning ourselves as, a team of researchers who are doing a research project. But at the same time, we're saying things like, how does your business gain the maximum potential from this diversity? How do you retain it? So we're moving into something which is more consultancy here. We're implicitly promising, we can help you with all of your problems if you just give us access. But we never say consultancy. We never say that we're consultants. But this was still taken up by some of the informants, so that in one workplace where I talked initially to HR, who directed me to this head of department who had what they said was a very international department, and they thought it would be great for me and for them if I went there. So I started corresponding with this head of department, and she was setting up days for me to observe some of her employees. And this is one of the emails that she sent out. And the topic line says, a day with CBS consultant. CBS is Copenhagen Business School. So suddenly, I'm the CBS consultant. And it's like, oh, what do they actually expect me to do? And I didn't really say anything about it. And she also, further down in the email, she said, Dorte will be following you for a day due to our participation in a CBS study. So she's still acknowledging I am actually also doing a study, but mostly I am now the CBS consultant. And I think that was quite important to me gaining, because I got full access to that company. I could spend as many days as I wanted and talk to everyone, and and I mean, they're quite concerned with billing their hours in that company. So someone spending 1 hour doing an interview with me would need to be billed to some kind of account. So it's not that they generally don't care about time. They do. I was also in meetings where someone was 4 minutes late, and that was not acceptable. So I think it was important that I was seen as a consultant in this case in order to gain access to this department at all. Yes, sometimes this role is something that changes over time. Sometimes you enter the company as a researcher, but then when you go in to provide feedback, you suddenly become a consultant. And this has also happened in other settings where it has changed over time. But here it was more of a dual positioning from the beginning. Yeah. Another example of what can happen is that sometimes you go into these workplaces and people have these. There are issues in the workplace that you can't talk to your colleagues about, or your manager. And then this person comes in and you're in a room alone with the doors closed, and she starts asking about how is your day at work and what is going on here and what's it like to be in an international workplace, or what it's like coming to Denmark. And suddenly there's this person who's willing to listen to you, and everything just comes pouring out, and you end up being kind of a therapist instead. And the question is how you should react to that, and because the relationship is changing. Suddenly you're becoming, are we friends now? Does that mean we should go out for coffee afterwards? And what is happening here? And I have an example I want to play for you. This is in another large Danish company. It's in an HR department, and I'm interviewing the one international employee that they have, and she's quite new. And her role is that she's an HR partner, and she's dividing her time between two offices. The office where we're conducting this interview, where all the other HR people are, and then when she's out in the business areas, when she's talking to the people that she's HR person for. And she's talking about how she'd been prepared that out in the business areas, it might be a problem that she was not Danish speaking, that she was international, because they weren't used to that. But she hadn't been prepared for it being a problem in this office. And then this is how it goes.
I think you mentioned that it might be a challenge in the business areas, because they are very Danish.
Yeah.
And they've been used to having a Danish HR partner forever. And the first one was not. So he had mentioned that might be a challenge. And so I was aware, but I haven't felt that was a challenge there at all. Which was actually quite surprising for me.
Yeah. So they've adapted quite easily.
Yeah.
Over there.
And it just felt very natural. So that's, sometimes I feel like, I prefer to be in that office than this office. I'm telling you.
I just together with the information from the other workplaces, and it's not uncommon.
No.
You're talking about.
No.
There's
many similar
as well.
feelings.
What about do you have?
Yeah. So she's talking about how, it actually wasn't a challenge out in the business area, but when she's then comparing the two workplaces, she's saying, I find that I prefer being in that other workplace compared to this. And then she starts laughing, and she says, well, I'm only telling you. So I can't tell anyone else, but I can tell you these things. And I think when the laughing also kind of indicates that there's some kind of transgression going on here. I shouldn't really be saying this, but okay, I'm only saying it to you because he doesn't want to say anything bad about her colleagues. But what's really interesting is then how I respond to this, because I'm saying, well, that's really interesting because together with the information from the other workplaces, because I'm a researcher, I go to other workplaces, I'm not really a friend. Also, there are many examples found in the literature, and especially that totally moves it out of the, okay, we can have this conversation about your problems, into me being like, no, we really can't. So in this example, you can see the researcher kind of resisting this boundary crossing into something else. And it comes up again later in the interview because she has a lot of issues that she needs to talk about. She's also talking about how it's been really hard to make friends with the Danes. And she says things like, that's tough when you're in a new place, and it's tough because you feel very alone. And in those examples, I kind of just go along with minimal feedback, like, okay, I don't push her away in those instances. So it's not, it's not consistent either how you respond to these situations. But I think that you get different data if you allow yourself to be put in the position of someone they can confide in. But the question is whether are you also crossing some kind of boundary that's ethically problematical? Why are you then promising them another kind of relationship that maybe, I mean, I found, going over this data again, when she was talking about how tough it was in Denmark and finding people she could relate to, I think, should I have said that, we could meet somewhere doing something afterwards? But then we're in a completely different place from being a researcher and someone being researched that I would only meet with 3 or 4 times. So I asked later when I came back whether these topics had been taboo. Was this something you could talk about, being international and using Danish versus English? And they all agreed. I had everyone there, and they know that we could not talk about that a year ago when you first came here. This was definitely a taboo topic. Yes. And then there's this, which I think is particularly relevant for younger researchers. Whether you're a bona fide researcher or whether you're just a student doing a project. And obviously this came up a lot more when I was younger and when I was actually doing my PhD project, and that the first data set that I'm referring to. And it happened a lot in this company. I was there for 5 months doing very long-term ethnographic fieldwork, but I was in a lot of different departments, so I continually had to introduce myself to new people. And there were cases where I had to actively resist being assigned the position of just a PhD student, because this was a research company. They were doing pharmaceutical research. So a lot of my informants were used to working with PhD students, or they had at one time been PhD students. And PhD students were definitely at the bottom of the ladder there. It was not a prestigious position, whereas, I had just gotten the position. I was quite excited about it. But it was more like, we're going to have to push that meeting, or we can't do that, or, whenever, and your little project. And I felt I had to be like, I'm actually also teaching at the university, and I have, students coming in for exams on Tuesday, so we can't, move the thing. But this was mostly with white collar and management types. But there were other examples from the same workplace, but in other departments, where it was a good thing being seen as just a student. After a while, I managed to get into the service department with the cleaning staff, because I was also interested in the blue-collar staff and how they were dealing with it. The topic was English as a corporate language. And I had, among the white-collar staff, it was easy to get to know people and say, well, can I come and hang out in your department? But here I had gone through the manager, and she had set me up with this work team. We were meeting at 4 a.m., which was when they came in, which was the middle of the night for me. And then I would follow them around for the day. And when I showed up, they were clearly very apprehensive about what was going on. I mean, what is this girl doing here? Why does she want to look at us work? Is she going to report back to the manager whether we clean things well enough? And they didn't say so, but you can kind of, you can tell when people are being skeptical. And then they started, they were women in their 50s. There were this team of 6 cleaning assistants. And then at one point they asked, what is this project you're doing, this paper you're writing? How long is the paper? And I said, it'll probably be around 300 pages. Like, wow, that's a long paper. Like for a school project. Like, yeah, it is rather long. And I didn't really feel this was a time or place to say, I'm actually a researcher, I'm doing my PhD. So I just went along with a rather long school project that I was doing and saying things like, I'm so glad you can help me, because I don't know anything about these things, and it's really helpful. And that, that worked. And now it sounds like I was being all manipulative and conscious about these things. And I was really just, when I look back, I think I was really just going with the flow. But when I started writing the research methodology chapter and looking at, what I had done, there were definitely times when being seen as a PhD student was something that I was resisting, emphasizing instead more prestigious position as a university researcher. And then there were other times when it was really good to be just a student. Amazingly, it still comes up sometimes, people thinking I'm a student. And now it's a little bit more, I'm not. So, I can't actually go with that. But for me, it's about it's about creating rapport with informants, and you want them to like you so that they'll talk to you. And it happened a few months ago in a meeting with this this HR person we just heard talking, I was shadowing her, and I had told her to warn people that I would be participating in meetings. And she had done so by sending around an email saying, this PhD student is going to follow me, because she thought I was a PhD student. And then when I come into the meeting, these people actually heard it as student, because, you know, they may not know what a PhD student is, so student is fine. And then this guy starts talking to me about, my son also goes to CBS, maybe you're in the same class. And it's like, and I really wanted to get into his department. At the same time, I couldn't just, you know, pretend to be a student in his son's class. It was like, well, I think I may actually be teaching your son's class. So that is a lot easier when you are actually a PhD student. Now it's becoming harder. But yeah, it would actually be easier in some instances if I could have just been a student. So these are my main examples, but these are not the only identities that are ascribed to me or that I use when I am out in the field. I have also variously been assigned identities as a girl, a spy, and a language expert, which I think is quite a catchy subtitle. I hope to be able to use sometime. I was in this warehouse recently observing, mostly because I was interested in the Eastern European truck drivers who deliver goods and who don't speak anything but Bulgarian, and what then happens with the Danish blue-collar workers. They need to be sure that it's the right goods delivered and they're taking them to the right country if they're taking goods. And so that's what I was interested in. And I was standing in this corner from where I took this picture most of the day. And there were people working, you know, all over the place. And I did notice that a lot of people came over. It seemed like they hadn't really been informed about my presence. So several guys, it was mostly guys, but also some girls, came over and were like, oh, so who are you? And what are you doing here? And like, oh, that's nice. People are interested in my research. That's how cool. And then the next day I was observing in the customer service department. And the girls in the office start joking about how I caused this stir yesterday because there was a new girl in the warehouse. It's like, I was a girl? They came over because I was a girl? I thought, you know, I was a researcher and they were interested in my research. And now that you say it, they were, you know, only guys came over. Like, oh, I was being a girl? So it's very disappointing. And it truly hadn't occurred to me until they started joking about how, you know, wow, yesterday in the warehouse. Whereas the spy thing, you know, that it came up when I was doing my PhD, for instance, with these service assistants. So after spending the day with them, they were like, we didn't know what you were doing here. We thought maybe you were checking on us. And even people who knew I was doing something with language would kind of apologize if they would swear. Because like, don't tell my boss I did that. I was like, yeah, well, haha. And, you know, but that's not really what I'm doing. I'm not checking up on you. And it happened again in this place with the warehouse where the CEO's personal assistant had been kind enough to set up a series of interviews for me. And for the first 3 interviews, people just came to the meeting room that I had been assigned and we conducted the interviews. And then for the 4th interview, which was with someone from the warehouse, the person didn't turn up and I didn't really know what to do. So I went to the personal assistant and said, you know, this byDorte, she hasn't shown up. And she just grabbed the phone, called byDorte and said, yeah, you had an interview with Dorte. Could you come up here? Okay. Like, okay, that's not really how I meant it. And then byDorte came up, and this is from my field notes. And it doesn't really say everything, but she came up into the room and she was basically like this. And I was like, hi, is this a bad time? Or it's totally fine with me if we reschedule or cancel. And then she said, this is something I have to do. So it's like, she was really positioning me as, you know, management's flunky, someone who is like, if you know, you're doing their bidding, and if I don't do this, it'll have repercussions for me. And so we went through with the interview. She didn't want to, and at that point I didn't really want to either, because I don't want to interview people who don't want to be interviewed. But she made it clear that she felt it would have consequences if she didn't go through with this interview. It was 14 minutes and we managed to become quite good friends at the end of it. But it was a very uncomfortable position. And obviously this happens a lot more with informants who I haven't contacted myself. But you can't always contact informants yourself. Sometimes you have to rely on managers or assistants setting up things for you, and then these kinds of things happen. And finally, I'm not quite sure how this happens, but they get that I'm doing something to do with language or communication, and I get asked to correct people's emails or manuscripts or their English in all sorts of ways. And this came up while I had already started working on this paper, and I was observing someone, and she turns around from the computer where she's working and says, "Can I ask you something since you're sitting here anyway?" I'm like, "Yes." "Is it shine had?" "No, that's not what you say." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's right." So, I'm suddenly, the English teacher sitting in the back of the room being very helpful to her. And in this case, I went along with it. But then a couple of days before that, in the same company, I was observing a meeting between what they call the language group, which is some employees who are working on implementing a language policy. And then a couple of people from an external consultancy who are they're doing language teaching. And they had this initial meeting to discuss how the language teaching in the company would take place. So they would be teaching employees English. And then after that, there would be a session where these two people from the language teaching company would interview employees. And I was just supposed to observe both parts, but the owner of this language teaching company turns to me after the first meeting when they're about to conduct these interviews, say, "Well, you can help us with that, right? You can rate the employees and help us with that?" And I'm like, no, I'm just observing. I'll be in the corner observing things. I'm not rating people. So it's not that I mind being a language expert in some situations, and when I'm reflecting on why I reacted so strongly in one case and so nicely in another, I mean, she was asking for very little, and we had known each other for a while, whereas he was a complete stranger who was basically asking me to do his job. He had been asked to come over and assess the employees, and suddenly he's saying, "Can you basically do that for me?" Which is not my job, and which, I couldn't really be observing things if I'm evaluating 17 employees. So, I think this brings me to my discussion. I will try to limit myself to 3 points. And the first is about positionality and identity. That, of course, macro-sociological categories such as age and gender are important, as we have also seen here, but other types of identities are also important when we talk about positionality of the researcher. So these more local identities where you're being a researcher, or you're being a consultant, or you're being a student, and the more transitory roles where you're someone who gives expert advice, but you only do that for 5 minutes, and 2 seconds later you're back to being the researcher again. Or you are actually all of these at the same time. You can be a girl and a researcher and a giver of expert advice at the same time. We have also seen that these identities are co-constructed and that they are dynamic, that they're changing, and that they are sometimes accepted and sometimes rejected. So but also that you can't always reject it. What do you do when an email comes out saying CBS consultant? Should you write back and say, "No, please call me researcher"? That you can't always control these positions. And then there's a point about access. I haven't been very explicit about it, but I believe that these positions and positionings influence our access to data, to settings, to different kinds of informants. Let's see. Yeah, I want to go back to this one. So where you stand literally influences what you will see, but also what you will be allowed to see. You can see how if you're a consultant, it will be easier for you to gain access to companies, to departments. It will be easier for you to have time with individual informants. Right now I'm trying to negotiate that I can come back to this company where they think I'm a consultant to do focus group interviews. And they're already worried that, if you want to do 3 focus groups with 6 participants, that's how many hours, and we need to find some way to pay for that. So in that particular place, it's very important to have some sort of reciprocity and to be seen as someone who can help them with that. In other cases, it's the ability to create some kind of rapport, intimacy, some kind of common ground with your informants that's important, and that will gain you access to data. Because sometimes it's not enough to just say, yes, you can have an hour with this person to do an interview. If that person doesn't want to talk to you because she doesn't like you or she doesn't understand what you're doing, then you won't get very much useful data out of that interview. Or you will anyway get different data from what you get with someone that you have developed some kind of relationship with. And finally, it's not just about being one or the other. You all the time have to navigate between different identities, the identities that are changing, and you have to wear several hats at once. You have to be all of these things. And I found this quote from researchers who say that it's a continual balancing act where you need to be all of these things at the same time. Insider, outsider, subordinate, sounding board, sympathizer and critic, therapist and spy, academic and consultant. But what they don't talk about here is that you negotiate these roles. They're not just there, and it's not one or the either, or you can, sometimes you're a little bit of both, sometimes you don't want to be, sometimes you have to be anyway. So there's a process of negotiation going on.
Okay, well, I think we should thank you for this very refreshing presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.